That morning, at the international airport, a young female CEO stepped out of the car without sparing a glance at the man who had driven her, a quiet, plainly dressed man with calm, unhurried eyes. In her mind, he was nothing more than a temporary hire, a stand-in for the day. But just minutes later, as she crossed into the VIP terminal, every soldier in the corridor snapped to attention and turned, in perfect unison, to salute that same quiet man with a formality so absolute, it stopped the entire hall cold. Not a single word was spoken. Just a salute. And Madison Clarke began to realize she had very badly misjudged who had been sitting in the front seat beside her. What would you do if the person you dismissed turned out to be someone an entire nation had never forgotten? The city was already breathing fast by 5:30 in the morning. Delivery trucks rumbled through intersections still slick from overnight rain, and the first commuter trains moved like distant lights beneath the gray pre-dawn sky. At Meridian International Airport, the corridors were filling early suits with rolling luggage, uniformed ground crew calling instructions over radio headsets, a cluster of military personnel moving through the East Terminal with the deliberate quiet of people trained never to rush. For Madison Clarke, none of that mattered. What mattered was the deal. She was 27 years old and had built Clartech Logistics from a two-person startup into a mid-sized company that handled supply chain architecture for some of the country's largest commercial and government clients. She wore her ambition the way she wore her tailored coat, precisely, intentionally, and without apology. That morning's meeting was with Hargrove Defense, one of the most selective procurement partners in the country's defense sector. Landing them would double Clartech's revenue and put Madison's name on the kind of list that 27-year-olds rarely reached. She had prepared for 6 weeks. She had rehearsed every contingency, and she had assumed her car service would arrive at 4:45, exactly as requested. It did not. At 4:50, her assistant called. The driver had a family emergency. The agency had a replacement, standing by, a man named Adrian Cole. He'd driven for the agency before. He was reliable, they said. He'd be there in 8 minutes. Madison exhaled through her nose, checked her watch, and decided that 8 minutes was acceptable. She did not ask anything more about him. Adrian arrived in 7. He pulled up to the lobby without fanfare, a clean, dark sedan. No music, no small talk waiting at the door. He stepped out to open the trunk for her luggage, and she barely looked at him. He was younger than she'd expected, late 20s maybe, with a lean, unhurried quality about him that she read immediately as unremarkable. He wore a plain dark jacket, no tie, clean shoes. His face was composed in a way that might have been mistaken for blankness if one wasn't paying close attention, and Madison Clarke, in that moment, was not paying close attention. He was a driver. She handed him the address and got in the back. The drive should have taken 32 minutes. Adrian navigated without using the dashboard GPS, choosing a route through the older industrial district that bypassed 2 highway merges Madison hadn't known to avoid. He didn't mention it. She spent the ride reviewing notes on her tablet, answering messages, running through talking points in a low murmur under her breath. He drove without speaking. When she asked him to adjust the temperature, he did. When she got a call and said hold on to no one in particular, he simply drove. If his silence bothered her, it would have required her to notice him first. At one point, she glanced up at the rearview mirror and caught his eyes, for a fraction of a second, pale, gray, steady, aimed at the road ahead with an attention that felt less like vigilance and more like patience. She looked back down at her notes. He was, she had already decided, exactly what he appeared to be, a man doing a temporary job, unexceptional in every way that mattered to her morning. The meeting was 40 minutes away. The contract was worth $7 million. There was no room in her head for anything else. It would have been easy to mistake Adrian Cole's silence for indifference. It was not. Every decision he made, the lane he chose, the distance he kept from the vehicle ahead, the particular stillness in his shoulders, when a siren wailed somewhere behind them, reflected a discipline so deeply embedded, it had stopped being effort and become nature. He had learned to observe without appearing to watch, to process without appearing to think, to be present in a room without registering as a presence. It was a skill built over years, refined under conditions that had nothing to do with morning drives to business meetings. But those years were behind him now. Or at least that was what he told himself. He was a driver. He drove. His phone buzzed twice on the center console. He didn't answer either call. The third time it buzzed, he glanced at the screen and something shifted in the corners of his eyes, a softening that Madison, looking up briefly from her notes, caught but didn't register as significant. He accepted the video call at a red light, angling the phone just slightly. A small voice crackled through the speaker, high and earnest. "Daddy, I can't find my bunny." The voice belonged to Lily Cole, 6 years old, who was at that moment standing in the doorway of a neighbor's apartment in her pajamas, one sock on and one sock off, holding a stuffed rabbit that she had, in fact, already found, but simply wanted him to know about. Adrian smiled a real smile, brief and full, and said, "She's in your left hand, sweetheart." There was a pause, then laughter. "Oh." He told her he'd be back by afternoon, that there was oatmeal on the stove, and that Mrs. Patterson next door would check on her at 7. "I know, Daddy," Lily said, in the patient tone of someone who has been told a thing many times and chooses not to mind. The call lasted 45 seconds. Madison had heard all of it. She had not meant to listen, but the car was quiet and the voice was clear. She watched him set the phone down and return his attention to the road. As the light changed, his expression already settled back into its composed, unreadable steadiness. She noted it the way she noted most things she did not find immediately useful as data without category. He had a daughter. The daughter sounded cheerful. He drove the way a person drives when they have learned to keep their interior life entirely separate from whatever room they happen to be occupying. She told herself it didn't change anything. He was still a stand-in driver. The fact that he was clearly also a father, one who spoke to his child with a gentleness that was neither performed nor cloying, did not reclassify him in her mental hierarchy. She had built a company. She had earned a meeting that 40 other firms would give almost anything to secure. She could not afford to spend her cognitive bandwidth on the personal circumstances of a man whose job was to get her to the airport on time. And he was going to get her there on time. She could see the terminal signs in the distance already. What she could not see, and would not have known to look for, was the quality of his attention, the way his eyes moved across the terminal entrance as he pulled in, reading it the way a cartographer reads a map he already knows. Not searching, simply confirming. Meridian International's departure level was a long, wide curve of glass and concrete, and at 6:15 in the morning, it was operating at roughly 70% of its daily capacity. Ground crew directed traffic in orange vests. A pair of military transport vehicles sat along the far curb, engines idling. 3 uniformed soldiers stood near the east checkpoint entrance, speaking in low voices, coffee cups in hand. Madison registered none of them. She was thinking about the 9 o'clock presentation and the specific language in Section 4 of the Procurement Annex that had been giving her trouble since Tuesday. Adrian pulled the sedan to the drop-off zone and came to a smooth stop. He stepped out and opened the trunk before she'd finished unbuckling her seatbelt. She climbed out, took the extended handle of her rolling case, said thank you in the flat, professional register she used for service interactions, the tone that conveyed both acknowledgement and termination simultaneously, and turned toward the terminal entrance without looking at him. She was 3 steps away when she heard the sound. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a command. It was the sound of boots on pavement, multiple pairs, moving with precision, the distinctive sharp staccato of military personnel snapping to attention. Madison's pace slowed without her consciously deciding to slow it. The three soldiers who had been standing near the east checkpoint were no longer standing casually. They were at full attention. Shoulders back, chins level, arms rigid, and every one of them was facing Adrian Cole. The soldier in the center, a man with a sergeant's insignia on his collar, and a face that had learned a long time ago not to show surprise easily, had his hand raised to his forehead in a salute so precise and deliberate it looked rehearsed. The other two had followed a half-second later, with the automatic coordination of people responding to something they have been trained to recognize on instinct. A fourth soldier, appearing from the east checkpoint doorway, as if the motion had drawn him out, stopped when he saw what was happening and raised his hand as well. Adrian stood beside the open trunk of the sedan. He returned the salute, one clean, unhurried motion, and gave the briefest of nods. His expression didn't change. He moved to close the trunk. Madison had stopped walking entirely. She stood on the sidewalk with her suitcase handle in her hand and her laptop bag over one shoulder. And she did not move for a full 4 seconds. Around her, the ordinary machinery of the terminal continued. A ground crew member pushed a luggage cart past. A taxi ahead of their sedan pulled away from the curb. An announcement played overhead about a departure gate change for a flight to Denver. None of it seemed to touch the small pocket of stillness that had formed around the man closing a car trunk and the 4 soldiers who had saluted him. She had been to this airport dozens of times. She had passed through military checkpoints, VIP terminals, secure corridors with federal contractors. She knew what a standard courtesy gesture looked like, and she knew what a formal military salute looked like. What she had just witnessed was the second kind, not a wave, not an acknowledgement, but an act of institutional respect so precise and unanimous that it could not have been spontaneous. Those men had known who he was the moment they saw him. They had responded to his presence the way trained people respond to rank, not because they were ordered to, but because something in them said they should. Adrian walked around to the driver's side of the sedan without hurrying. He glanced across the roof of the car in her general direction, and for a moment, the morning light caught the gray of his eyes with a clarity that made them look less like the eyes of a hired driver, and more like the eyes of someone who had seen a great many things and retained the memory of all of them. Then he got in the car. The sedan pulled away from the curb. Madison Clarke stood on the sidewalk of Meridian International Airport and began, for the first time, to wonder who she had just been in a car with. She made it inside the terminal before she stopped pretending to be unaffected. At the check-in desk, her hands moved through the routine of handing over her passport and boarding documents, but her mind was back on the sidewalk, running the image of those 4 soldiers in a loop that she couldn't stop or redirect. The desk agent said something about her seat assignment, and she said, "That's fine," without registering what the question had been. The agent repeated it. Madison blinked, focused, answered, and moved on. At the security lane, she overheard 2 airport staff members near the luggage screening belt, speaking in low, clipped tones. She caught the word Cole, and her head turned sharply. The younger of the 2, a woman with a lanyard from the Ground Operations Division, was saying something to her colleague that ended with a shake of her head and an expression that was equal parts awe and discomfort, the look of someone recalling a story they can't quite bring themselves to tell in full. Madison did not catch the rest. They moved apart when they noticed her watching. She cleared security and entered the military-adjacent VIP corridor that led toward the international departure lounges, used by government and defense contractors. A uniformed officer at the inner checkpoint, tall, late 40s, the kind of stillness that comes from 25 years of professional discipline, glanced at her credentials, then looked up. His gaze moved past her shoulder toward the exterior, where the drop-off zone was no longer visible. There was something in his face she couldn't name. She asked him, with the directness that had always served her well, who the man was who had dropped her off. The officer looked at her for a moment. His expression did not change, exactly. But something behind it did a careful internal rearrangement, like someone choosing which door to open and which to leave closed. "A former serviceman," he said. "We recognized him." Madison said that was more than recognition. The officer held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds. "Yes, ma'am," he said. It was. Then he handed back her credentials and moved his attention to the next person in line. She didn't push further, not because she lacked the instinct she had built her career partly on knowing when and how to press, but because something in his tone had told her, without ambiguity, that she was not going to get the rest of the story from a checkpoint officer in a public corridor. The information existed. It was real. It was simply not here, and not now. She filed it in the part of her mind that handled deferred problems, and kept walking. At the entrance to the VIP lounge, she paused and looked back toward the terminal's main hall. The drop-off zone was a vague shimmer of glass and morning gray at the far end of the concourse. The dark sedan was long gone. The 4 soldiers had disappeared back inside the checkpoint. Everything looked exactly as it always looked, but she felt unsettled in a way she could not argue herself out of. She had made a judgment about a person within 30 seconds of meeting him quickly, confidently, based on available information. The problem, she was beginning to understand, was that she had not had nearly enough of it. The 9 o'clock meeting with Hargrove Defense was held in one of the airport's secure conference facilities, a glass-walled room on the 2nd floor of the East Concourse, with federal contractor credentials required at the door, and a view of the tarmac that made the whole setup feel deliberately cinematic. The Hargrove team was exactly as she had profiled them. Direct, detail-oriented, professionally skeptical. She performed well. She knew the numbers, she anticipated the hard questions, and she delivered Section 4 with an ease that surprised even her. The meeting ended with handshakes and a conditional timeline for next steps. It was, by any reasonable measure, a success. It should have left her energized. Instead, she found herself in the atrium afterward, coffee in hand, mind still snagged on a sidewalk, and 4 soldiers and a car trunk clicking shut. She called her assistant and asked for whatever could be found on a driver registered with the agency under the name Adrian Cole. The assistant came back 20 minutes later with almost nothing. A valid commercial driver's license, a clean record, an address in the residential district east of downtown, and an employment history that started 2.5 years ago, with a gap before it listed simply as prior service. No branch, no rank, no detail. He had tried to pull additional background and hit a wall, not a gap in the database, but what appeared to be a deliberate seal, like someone had taken a file and locked it. She returned to the checkpoint corridor on a pretext and caught one of the airport's senior operations staff near the secure door. She asked again, more indirectly this time, framing it as a background concern related to the morning's contracted service. The woman, mid-50s, 23 years on staff, studied Madison's face for a moment and apparently decided she fell somewhere between curiosity and genuine concern. "All I can tell you," the woman said carefully, "is that he's someone we don't forget. Most of the people who know what I mean by that aren't in a position to explain it to someone who doesn't already know." Madison parsed the sentence. "He did something," she said. "He did more than something," the woman replied, looking toward the window. "He gave up everything to do it." And then he walked away from the recognition entirely. She paused. "That's all I'm going to say. It was enough. Not enough to build a full picture, but enough to shift the outline of the one she already had." She walked back to the atrium and stood in the stream of morning foot traffic and let herself think in a way she rarely allowed during working hours openly, without agenda, without a conclusion already drafted and waiting to be confirmed. She had met veterans before. She had worked with former military contractors, hired people with clearance histories, attended briefings where the men across the table carried the specific controlled stillness of people, trained in environments she would never see. She knew the vocabulary of service, at least the professional surface of it. But what she had seen on the sidewalk that morning wasn't vocabulary. It was instinct, the kind that bypasses language entirely and speaks in posture and timing and the way a group of trained men respond to the presence of someone who has earned something that cannot be awarded by a title. She had spent years building a company on the premise that she could read a room. She was starting to think she had walked into one this morning and read it entirely wrong. She thought about the way he had returned that salute, one clean, unhurried motion, and then simply closed the trunk of the car. As though the two things were exactly equal. As though being recognized by 4 soldiers and getting back behind the wheel of a sedan were the same kind of task, requiring the same kind of attention. Maybe, she thought. For him they were. She wasn't supposed to see the file. It came into her hands by a chain of small coincidences that, in retrospect, felt less like coincidence and more like the universe running an experiment. One of the Hargrove defense representatives, a retired colonel named Gerald Briggs, who was on contract with Hargrove as a security consultant, and who had an absent-minded habit of leaving printed materials on conference room tables, left behind a folder when the team packed up after the meeting. It was thin, just a few pages, and Madison's assistant collected it with the rest of the room materials before realizing what it was. He brought it to Madison, uncertain whether to return it or hold it for the colonel to claim. She took it. She told herself she was going to hand it to the security desk. She told herself that for approximately 45 seconds before she opened it, the pages were not classified. They were summary notes. Operational background for the Hargrove meeting's context section. The kind of briefing document that a consultant like Briggs would prepare to remind himself of the human landscape behind a contract discussion. Most of it was dry. Unit designations, timeline notations, outcomes measured in procurement language that translated human action into organizational result. But 3 pages in, there was a name, Adrian Cole. Rank, Captain. Unit, listed only by a numerical designation she didn't recognize, but suspected was the kind that didn't advertise itself. Time in service, 7 years. Status, honorably discharged, by request, 3 years prior. The notes beside his name were brief. Primary Field Commander. Operation Sinclair Ridge. Outcome, mission, critical. Casualties, none on our side. Consequence. Protected status for 48 personnel over a 72-hour period under active threat. And then, in Briggs's own handwriting in the margin, a single line that she read 3 times before she believed she was reading it correctly. Walked away from everything afterward, raised a flag to protect his family. We honor that. She set the folder down on the table and looked at the tarmac through the window for a long time. Operation Sinclair Ridge. She didn't know the name, but she understood operational language well enough to decode the shape of what was described. 48 personnel, 72 hours under active threat. Mission critical. These were not the metrics of a routine exercise. These were the metrics of something that had gone badly wrong, in a way that required one person to step into the center of it and hold it together long enough for 48 other people to get out. And then she thought about the phone call at the red light, the small voice asking about a stuffed rabbit, the 45 seconds of patience and warmth, the word sweetheart, said in a register, so different from everything else about him that it had felt like opening a door into a different room. She thought about the seal on his records, the woman who had said he gave up everything, the note in the margin, walked away from everything afterward, raised a flag to protect his family. She thought about Lily. The picture came together slowly. The way pictures do when you've been looking at the wrong version of them for too long. He hadn't left the military because of failure. He hadn't left because of injury, or age, or disillusionment. He had left because the work required him to become invisible, and becoming invisible meant his daughter grew up with a father-shaped absence instead of an actual father. He had chosen her. He had chosen a plain apartment in the East Residential District and a commercial driver's license and a job that required almost nothing of him and gave him home by afternoon. He had chosen the child's voice at the red light over whatever the alternative had been. Madison Clarke had looked at a man in a dark jacket with quiet eyes and had read him as unremarkable. She had handed him her address the way you hand someone a receipt without looking, without thinking, without the slightest acknowledgement that the person receiving it might be someone whose interior life was more complex, more layered, more costly than anything in her morning's agenda. She had been wrong about him in a way that was not simply factual but structural. She had not just gotten the detail wrong. She had gotten the category wrong entirely. She held the folder for another moment. Then she slid it into a clean envelope, wrote Colonel Briggs's name on the front, and handed it to a desk attendant to be returned. She sat back down. The terminal hummed around her with its ordinary sounds, but something in the way she occupied her chair had changed. She was sitting in it differently, with a fraction less certainty, a fraction more attention. The follow-up with Hargrove Defense was scheduled for 3 o'clock, a second session to review the technical specifications Madison had submitted 2 weeks prior. She had assumed it would be a formality confirmation of details already agreed upon, a walkthrough of implementation timelines. She was wrong about that, too. The Hargrove technical team arrived with 3 laptops, a set of printed spreadsheets, and the specific energy of people who had found something they weren't happy about. The problem was in the logistics data architecture that Clartech had proposed for the first implementation phase. A miscalculation in the routing algorithm, not a catastrophic error, but the kind of precise, embedded flaw that a defense contractor's technical reviewers are specifically trained to locate and are specifically unwilling to overlook. If the numbers weren't corrected before close of business, the conditional timeline from the morning's meeting would dissolve. The contract would be back on the table. Madison worked the room. She pulled up her engineering lead on a secure video line, walked through the flagged sections, identified the error within 12 minutes, and began constructing a corrected model in real time. The Hargrove technical team watched with the patient skepticism of people who have seen firms try to improvise their way out of data problems before. Her engineering lead was talking through the correction methodology. When he hit a variable, he couldn't immediately resolve a sequencing conflict in the third distribution node that kept generating a cascade error no matter how he adjusted the inputs. He went quiet. The silence in the conference room acquired weight. Adrian Cole was in the corridor outside. He had driven Madison back to the airport for the afternoon session, parked in the short-term lot, and was waiting in the atrium with a coffee and the particular quality of stillness he carried everywhere. The conference room's glass wall was visible from where he sat. He had not been looking in, but sound carried in the atrium, particularly the kind of controlled tension that technical conversations develop when they are not going well, and when Madison stepped into the corridor to take the call off speakerphone, he heard the problem. Not all of it, but enough. He waited until she had ended the call. Then he said, with no preamble, "The cascade error. It's probably in the sequencing priority of the third node. If the algorithm is treating simultaneous inputs as sequential ones, the priority weighting collapses." Madison turned from her phone and looked at him. "Try assigning a timestamp buffer between the input layers," he continued. 200 millisecond separation. It forces the system to treat them as distinct events rather than concurrent ones. The cascade stops. He said it the way someone states a thing they have already processed and arrived at with the flat certainty of a person who sees no particular reason to dress up an answer. Then he picked up his coffee cup and returned his attention to the middle distance. She went back inside. She told her engineering lead. There was a pause of approximately 40 seconds, during which she could hear keystrokes. Then her lead said, slowly, "That works. That actually works." The Hargrove technical reviewer sitting across the table leaned forward slightly, looked at the corrected projection, and nodded once. The tension in the room dropped by several degrees. After the meeting, she walked back to the corridor. Adrian was still there. Same posture, same stillness. Where did you learn that? She asked. He looked at her with those steady gray eyes. I used to work with systems that couldn't afford cascade errors, he said. Then he picked up his jacket and told her the car was in Lot C whenever she was ready. The security incident happened at 4:47 in the afternoon. It began the way most crises begin, not with a dramatic announcement, but with a small, specific wrongness that trained eyes notice before the general alarm has any reason to sound. A maintenance cart near the east checkpoint had been parked at an unusual angle, its side panel partially open, in a way that didn't match standard operational position. Adrian saw it from 30 meters away as he was walking Madison toward the terminal exit. He didn't say anything. He didn't break stride, but he began navigating the corridor in a way that moved them away from the cart's sightline without appearing to change direction at all. A trajectory adjustment so slight that Madison didn't notice it until she realized, 2 minutes later, that they were at the south exit rather than the east one. He excused himself. He said he needed to check something and asked her to wait by the pillar near the south entrance. He said it quietly, without urgency, in the tone of someone mentioning a minor logistical detail. She started to say something and then stopped, because there was something in the way he said it. A particular quality of calm that was not casual at all, but was its opposite. The calm of a person managing a great deal of information simultaneously, that made her stand by the pillar without asking why. What happened in the next 9 minutes was, from Madison's vantage point, fragmented and confusing. An airport security officer appeared from the east checkpoint. 2 uniformed military personnel moved from the south corridor, at a pace that was not quite running, but was not walking either. The maintenance cart was surrounded, and the surrounding happened without shouting, without the kind of visible escalation that draws attention, which meant it was being managed by people who understood that visible escalation makes things worse. A second security alert tone sounded briefly in the east section 2 pulses, then silence, and then the PA system announced a routine maintenance delay for one of the east gates, which was not a routine maintenance delay. Adrian was at the center of it. Not because he had been given authority in that space, but because something about the way he moved through it, the directness of his instructions to the security officer, the specific hand gestures he used to indicate perimeter positions, the way the military personnel responded to him, without hesitation, created a functional command structure out of what had been, moments earlier, a potentially serious, uncoordinated situation. He spoke to the security officer in a voice too low for Madison to hear, but she could see the officer's response. A nod, immediate compliance, the body language of someone who understood and was already moving. When the third responder arrived with a detection kit, Adrian was already there, pointing to the specific section of the panel that needed to be addressed first. The device, a malfunctioning electronic unit from a recently serviced piece of ground equipment, not a threat, though the first several minutes had not confirmed that with any certainty, was isolated and cleared in just under 8 minutes. The announcement about the east gate was retracted. The corridor reopened. Adrian walked back to the south entrance pillar and found Madison exactly where he'd left her. His jacket was still in his hand. His expression was the same as it had been all day. "We can go whenever you're ready," he said. She stared at him. "What just happened?" "A false alarm," he said. Handled. She looked at the east corridor, where airport staff were dispersing with the controlled normalcy of people trained to restore the appearance of order before the reality of it. She looked at the military officer who had responded to Adrian's hand gesture, a man with a captain's insignia who could, under any other circumstances, have claimed authority over the entire situation, standing near the east doorway with the posture of someone who has deferred to a higher competence and does not resent it. She looked at Adrian Cole. She looked at him the way she had not looked at him once in the entire day, fully, without the filter of the category she had assigned him at 5 in the morning outside her lobby. And what she saw, for the first time, was not the outline she had drawn. It was the actual shape of him, patient, precise, and quietly, carrying something she did not yet have the full vocabulary to name. Colonel Gerald Briggs found them in the atrium 20 minutes later. He was a large man in his early 60s, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of posture that does not relax even in civilian clothes. And when he walked into the atrium and saw Adrian Cole standing near the south windows, he stopped. The stop was involuntary, a half-second interruption in his stride. And then he crossed the room with a directness that bypassed Madison entirely, stopped in front of Adrian, and extended his hand. Adrian took it. "I heard what you just did," Briggs said. "From Sergeant Wallace." He said the response was coordinated in under 90 seconds. "The situation was manageable," Adrian said. "The situation was manageable because you managed it." Briggs held his hand a second longer, then let go. He turned to Madison. "Miss Clarke, do you know who this man is?" She said, honestly, that she was beginning to. Briggs looked from her to Adrian. There was a question in the look, a request for permission, almost, and Adrian gave no signal one way or another, which Briggs apparently read as permission, because he turned back to Madison and spoke. Adrian Cole was the commanding officer of a special operations unit for 7 years. He was one of the most effective field commanders in the program, not just in terms of mission outcome, but in the specific category of keeping his people alive. Operation Sinclair Ridge was the operation that ended his service. 48 personnel were held in a compromised extraction point for 72 hours under active hostile engagement. Adrian commanded the defense of that position without additional support, without confirmed resupply, and without evacuation for the first 40 hours. Briggs paused. Every single one of those 48 people came home. That's not a normal statistic. That is not even close to a normal statistic. Madison said nothing. He put in the paperwork for honorable discharge 8 months after that operation, Briggs continued. He didn't ask for recognition. He didn't enter the contractor pipeline, which every single person in his position does, because it pays extremely well, and he was exactly the kind of person it was built to recruit. He asked to be released, filed the paperwork correctly, and left. We honored it because he had earned the right to any request he wanted to make. Briggs glanced at Adrian. His daughter was 4 years old. He hadn't been home for more than 3 weeks at a time in the previous 2 years. He decided that was over. The atrium noise continued around them, rolling luggage, overhead announcements, a child somewhere asking a question in a loud, unself-conscious voice. None of it seemed to enter the perimeter of the conversation. "The salute this morning," Briggs said. Those men recognized him. When men who have served in certain environments encounter someone who held a particular kind of command, the kind defined not by rank, but by what was carried and how it was carried, there's a response that's not optional. It's not protocol. It's recognition. It's a different thing entirely. Adrian was looking at the window. Outside, a plane taxied slowly across the tarmac, its running lights blinking in the late afternoon gray. Madison thought about the morning. She thought about handing him the address without looking at him. She thought about the way she had said thank you with her back already half turned. The dismissal encoded in the angle of her body before she'd finished speaking the words. She thought about the thought she had formed automatically, confidently, as she did most thoughts about people she encountered, that he was exactly what he appeared to be, and that he appeared to be uncomplicated. She thought about Lily at the red light. She thought about the stuffed rabbit in the left hand, and 45 seconds of patience. "He chose this," she said. It wasn't a question. "He chose this," Briggs confirmed. Adrian turned from the window. His expression was, as it had been all day, composed and unhurried. But there was something in his eyes that Madison hadn't seen before, or perhaps had seen, and hadn't known what to read. Not bitterness, not pride, something quieter than either. The clear-eyed equanimity of someone who made a decision a long time ago and found that they still agree with it. A moment passed. Then 2 more soldiers entered the atrium from the east corridor, Sergeant Wallace and one of the officers from the security response, and crossed the space toward the three of them. They stopped at a respectful distance from Adrian. The sergeant's hand came up. The second officers followed. The salute held for 3 seconds, clean and formal, in the middle of a busy civilian airport atrium, in front of a logistics CEO who had spent her morning dismissing the man being honored. Adrian returned it, as he had done before. One motion, complete, unhurried. Then he lowered his hand. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said. Wallace said, "Sir." That was all. They turned and left, and Madison Clarke stood in the atrium of Meridian International Airport and felt something she was not accustomed to feeling in professional contexts. Not embarrassment exactly, not guilt exactly, but a particular species of clarity that arrives when you understand not just that you were wrong, but how you were wrong, and why, and what kind of thinking produced the wrongness in the first place. She asked him to wait. He waited, without impatience, while she found Colonel Briggs again and finished the conversation that needed to be finished, the contractual postscript. The handshakes, the professional courtesies that the day's earlier success had earned. When she came back to the atrium, Adrian was standing where she'd left him, jacket over one arm, watching the tarmac. He looked, as he had looked all day, like a man who was entirely accustomed to waiting and had made his peace with it long ago. She stood beside him for a moment before she spoke. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I decided who you were before I knew anything about you. I treated you like you were background." He looked at her. He didn't say "it's fine," or "don't worry about it," the reflexive social responses that would have allowed her to receive the apology without fully giving it. He simply looked at her in that steady, gray-eyed way, and let the words exist in the space between them. "You only saw what you came in expecting to see," he said, finally. "Most people do." "That's not an excuse," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." A pause, but it is a starting point. Her phone buzzed. She silenced it without looking at it. "Your daughter," she said. "Lily. You left everything for her." Something moved in his face, that same brief, full softness she had seen at the red light, the thing that made him look, for a moment, like the most real version of himself. "I left something for her," he said. "I also came home for her. Those aren't the same decision." She didn't have a response to that. She wasn't sure one was needed. He picked up his jacket. "Your flight's at 7:15, he said. "I can get you to the terminal in 20 minutes if you want to grab something to eat first." It was, in tone and delivery, exactly what he would have said at 5:30 that morning, practical, direct, devoid of performance. The only difference was that she was hearing it differently now. She was hearing the competence in it, the reliability, the quality of attention that expressed itself, not in grand statements, but in small, precise acts of follow-through. She said yes to dinner. They ate in the terminal restaurant, a place with too much overhead lighting, and a menu that was aggressively mediocre, and he ordered a coffee, and she ordered something she didn't finish, and they talked about almost nothing of consequence. He asked one question about the Hargrove meeting. She gave him a real answer. He listened in the way he did everything, with complete, undemonstrative attention, as though what she was saying was the only thing in the room worth hearing. When she boarded her flight at 7 to 10, she looked back once at the terminal. The dark sedan was long gone. She stood in the jet bridge for a second longer than she needed to. Then she boarded, settled into her seat, opened her notes. And for the first time, in a long time, she found herself thinking not about the deal or the numbers or the next meeting, but about what it actually meant to see a person, not the version of them you need them to be, but the version that exists whether or not you are paying attention. In the weeks that followed, people who worked with Madison Clarke noticed a change they couldn't quite name. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of transformation that announces itself in visible gestures. It was subtler than that, a shift in the temperature of her attention, a recalibration in the way she moved through rooms where other people were working, She started arriving to meetings a few minutes early, which was new, and spending those minutes looking around rather than reviewing her notes. She learned the names of the building's maintenance staff, and then of the junior logistics coordinators on the floor below her office, and then of the overnight security team she had walked past 200 times without seeing. She asked questions that didn't have an immediate business purpose. She listened to the answers. She stopped treating people's job titles as full descriptions of their contents. In one of her first company-wide addresses after the Hargrove contract was finalized, she said something that her senior team would reference for years afterward. She said, "I've been in the habit of evaluating people by what they're doing when I first meet them. I'm going to try instead to ask what they're capable of, and to understand that those two things are often very far apart." It got applause. She didn't tell anyone where it came from. Adrian Cole drove for the agency through the end of that season, and then accepted a part-time consulting role with a small logistics security firm that had found him through means he never quite explained to anyone who asked. He worked 3 days a week. The other 4 belonged to Lily. On Saturdays, they went to the farmers' market in the north quarter of the city, where she conducted lengthy negotiations for fruit, and he carried the bag and said very little. On Sunday mornings, he made oatmeal, and she complained about it in a cheerful, performative way that had become a ritual neither of them wanted to give up. He did not seek recognition. He did not maintain a profile. He did not attend events or join organizations or build the kind of institutional presence that his record would have opened to him with almost no effort. He lived, instead, in the exact radius he had chosen: small, careful, warm, and deliberate. The people who had served with him knew where he was. The people who had not would pass him in a grocery store or a school hallway and see a quiet man in ordinary clothes and form an impression that was entirely incomplete. That was, he had decided, all right, there is a particular dignity in being misread and choosing not to correct it. Adrian Cole understood this. He had made peace with the version of himself that the world saw: the unremarkable man, the background presence, the driver in the dark jacket, and he wore it without friction, because it cost him nothing that mattered, and it protected something that had cost him everything. One afternoon in early November, when the city had turned gray, and the light came low and amber through the buildings, Adrian Cole walked through the crowd at the North Market, with his daughter's hand in his. She was talking about something her teacher, a disagreement with a classmate, a book she had started and didn't want to finish because she didn't want it to end. He listened and responded and carried the bag, and they moved through the crowd, the way any father and daughter move through a crowd, unremarkably, invisibly, with the particular completeness of people who are exactly where they want to be. The people around them saw a father and a child. They did not see what he had carried, or what he had given up, or what he had chosen in its place. But the weight of it was there in every step, in every word he said to her, in the way he held her hand, firmly enough to anchor, gently enough to free, and those who had served with him would have recognized it immediately. They always did.